Biodiversity is not evenly distributed. Rather, it varies greatly across the globe as well as within regions. Among other factors, the diversity of all living things, biota, depends on temperature, precipitation, altitude, soils, geography and presence of other species. Terrestrial biodiversity is up to 25 times greater than ocean biodiversity. Latitudinal gradients. Generally, there is an increase in biodiversity from the poles to the tropics. Thus, localities at lower latitude have more species than localities at higher latitudes. This is often referred to as the latitudinal gradient in species diversity. Several ecological mechanisms may contribute to the gradient, but the ultimate factor behind many of them is the greater mean temperature at the equator compared to that of the poles. Hotspots. A biodiversity hotspot is a region with a high level of endemic species that is under threat from humans. Brazil's Atlantic forest is considered one such hotspot, containing roughly 20,000 plant species, 1,350 vertebrates and millions of insects. The island of Madagascar is also particularly notable. Colombia is characterized by high biodiversity, with the highest rate of species by area unit worldwide, and it has the largest number of endemisms, that is, species that are not found naturally anywhere else of any country. About 10% of species of the earth live in Colombia, including over 1,900 species of birds, more than that in Europe and North America combined. Colombia has 10% of the world's mammal species, 14% of amphibian species and 18% of the bird species of the world. Biodiversity is a result of 3.5 billion years of evolution. The fossil record suggests that the last few million years featured the greatest biodiversity in history. Estimates of the present global macroscopic species diversity vary from 2 million to 100 million, with a best estimate of somewhere near 9 million, the vast majority of arthropods. Diversity appears to increase continually in the absence of natural selection. Biodiversity and ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are the suite of benefits that ecosystems provide to humanity. They are provisioning services which include the production of renewable resources, example, food, wood and fresh water. Regulatory services, which are those that lessen environmental change, that is, climate regulation, pest and disease control. Cultural services, which represent human value and enjoyment, example, landscape aesthetics, cultural heritage, outdoor recreation and spiritual significance. Biodiversity and agriculture. The control of associated biodiversity is one of the great agriculture challenges that farmers face. On monoculture farms, the approach is generally to eradicate associated diversity using a suite of biologically destructive pesticides, mechanized tools and transgenic engineering techniques, then to rotate crops. Although some polyculture farmers use the same techniques, they also employ integrated pest management strategies as well as strategies that are more labor intensive but generally less dependent on capital. Biotechnology and energy. Interspecific crop diversity is, in part, responsible for offering variety in what we eat. Intraspecific diversity, the variety of alleles within a single species, also offers a choice in our diets. If a crop fails in a monoculture, we rely on agriculture diversity to replant the land with something new. If a wheat crop is destroyed by a pest, we may plant a hardier variety of wheat the next year, relying on intraspecific diversity. We may forego wheat production in that area and plant a different species altogether, relying on interspecific diversity. Even an agricultural society which primarily grows monocultures relies on biodiversity at some point. The Irish potato blight of 1846 was a major factor in the deaths of 1 million people and the immigration of about 2 million. It was the result of planting only 2 potato varieties, both vulnerable to blight. When rice grassy stunt virus struck rice fields from Indonesia to India in 1970s, 6,273 varieties were tested for resistance. Only one was resistant, an Indian variety, and unknown to science only since 1966. This variety formed a hybrid with no other varieties and is now widely grown. Biodiversity and human health. Earth's surviving biodiversity provides resources for increasing the range of food and other products suitable for human use, although the present extinction rate shrinks that potential. Many of the anticipated health risks of climate change are associated with changes in biodiversity. Example, changes in populations and distribution of disease vectors, scarcity of fresh water, impacts on agricultural biodiversity and food resources. This is because the species most likely to disappear are those that buffer against infections, disease transmission. Some of the health issues influenced by biodiversity include dietary health and nutritional security, infectious disease, medical science and medicinal resources, social and psychological health. Biodiversity is also known to have an important role in reducing disaster risk and in post-disaster relief and recovery efforts. Biodiversity provides critical support for drug discovery and the availability of medicinal resources. A significant proportion of drugs are derived directly or indirectly from biological sources. At least 50% of the pharmaceutical compounds on the US market are derived from plants, animals and microorganisms, while about 80% of the world's population depends on medicines from nature, either used in modern or traditional medical practice for primary health care. Biodiversity, business and industry. Many industrial materials derive directly from biological sources. These include building materials, fibers, dyes, rubber and oil. Biodiversity is also important to the security of resources such as water, timber, paper, fiber and food. As a result, biodiversity loss is a significant risk factor in business development and a threat to long economic sustainability. Biodiversity, leisure and cultural value. Biodiversity enriches leisure activities such as hiking, bird watching or natural history study. Biodiversity inspires musicians, painters, sculptors, writers and other artists. Many cultures view themselves as an integral part of the natural world which requires them to respect other living organisms. Popular activities such as gardening, fish keeping and specimen collecting strongly depend on biodiversity. Biodiversity and ecological services. Biodiversity supports many ecosystem services. There is a mounting evidence that biodiversity increases the stability of ecosystem functions through time. Diverse communities are more productive because they contain key species that have large influence on productivity, and differences in functional traits among organisms increase total resource capture. The impacts of diversity loss on ecological processes might be sufficiently large to rival the impacts of many other global drivers of environmental change. It plays a part in regulating the chemistry of our atmosphere and water supply. Biodiversity is directly involved in water purification, recycling nutrients, and providing fertile soils. Experiments with controlled environments have shown that humans cannot easily build ecosystems to support human needs. Discovered and predicted total number of species on land and the oceans. According to Mora and colleagues, the total number of terrestrial species is estimated to be around 8.7 million, while the number of ocean species is much lower, estimated at 2.2 million. The authors note that these estimates are strongest for eukaryotic organisms and likely represent the lower bound of prokaryotic diversity. Other estimates include 2,20,000 vascular plants, estimated using species area relation method, 0.7 to 1 million marine species, 10 to 30 million insects of some 0.9 million we know today, 5 to 10 million bacteria, 1.5 to 3 million fungi, estimates based on data from tropics, long-term non-tropical sites and molecular studies, and 1 million mites. The rate of extinction has increased. Many species may become extinct before they are described. Species loss rates. During the last century, decreases in biodiversity have been increasingly observed. In 2007, a German federal environmental minister, Sigmar Gabriel, cited estimates that up to 30% of all species will be extinct by 2050. Of these, about 1/8 of the known plant species are threatened with extinction. Estimates reach as high as 140,000 species per year, based on species area theory. Almost all scientists acknowledge that the rate of species lost is greater now than any time in human history, with extinctions occurring at rates hundreds of times higher than background extinction rates. As of 2012, some studies suggest that 25% of all mammal species could be extinct in 20 years. Threats. In 2006, many species were formally classified as rare or endangered or threatened. About 40% of 40,177 species assessed during the IUCN Red List criteria are now listed as threatened with extinction, a total of 16,119. John Diamond describes an evil quadret of habitat, destruction, overkill, introduced species and secondary extinctions. Edward O. Wilson prefers the acronym HIPPO, standing for habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, human overpopulation and overharvesting. However, the most authoritative classification in the use today is IUCN's classification of direct threats, which has been adopted by major international conservation organizations such as US Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International and BirdLife International. Habitat destruction has played a key role in extinctions, especially related to tropical forest destructions. Factors contributing to habitat loss are overpopulation, deforestation, pollution, which includes air pollution, water pollution, soil contamination, and global pollution. Habitat size and numbers of species are systematically related. Physically, larger species are those living at lower latitudes or in forests or oceans are more sensitive to reduction in habitat area. Conversion to trivial standardized ecosystems, example, monoculture following deforestation, effectively destroys habitat for more diverse species that preceded the conversion. Coextinctions are a form of habitat destruction. Coextinction occurs when an extinction or decline in one accompanies the other, such as in plants and beetles. The term invasive species is applied to species that breach the natural barriers that would normally keep them constrained. Without barriers, Such species occupy new territory, often supplanting native species by occupying their niches or by using resources that would some evidence suggest that invasive species are competitive in their new habitats because they are subject to less pathogen disturbance. Others report confounding evidence that occasionally suggests that species-rich communities harbor many native and exotic species simultaneously, while some say that diverse ecosystems are more resilient and resist invasive plants and animals. Not all introduced species are invasive, nor are all invasive species deliberately introduced. In cases such as the zebra mussel, invasion of the US waterways was unintentional. In other cases, such as mongooses in Hawaii, the introduced is deliberate but ineffective. Nocturnal rats were not vulnerable to the diurnal mongoose. Introducing new species often leaves the endemic and other local species unable to compete with the exotic species and unable to survive. The exotic organisms may be predators, parasites, or simply outcompete indigenous species for nutrients, water, and light. At present, several countries have already imported so many exotic species, particularly agricultural and ornamental plants, that their own indigenous fauna and flora may be outnumbered. Endemic species can be threatened with extinction through the process of genetic pollution. That is, uncontrolled hybridization, introgression and genetic swamping. Genetic pollution leads to homogenization or replacement of local genomes as a result of either a numerical and or fitness advantage of an introduced species. Hybridization and introgression are side effects of introduction and invasion. These phenomena can be especially detrimental to rare species that come into contact with more abundant ones. The abundant species can interbreed with the rare species, swamping its gene pool. This problem is not always apparent from morphological, that is the outward appearance, observations alone. Some degree of gene flow is normal adaptation and not all gene and genotype constellations can be preserved. However, hybridization with or without introgression may nevertheless create a rare species existence. Overexploitation. Overexploitation occurs when a resource is consumed at an unsustainable rate. This occurs on land in the form of overhunting, excessive logging, poor soil conservation in agriculture, and the illegal wildlife trade. Joe Wolson, director of the Wildlife Conservation Society's Asian programs, called the latter the single largest threat to the biodiversity in Asia. The international trade of endangered species is second in size only to drug trafficking. About 25% of world's fisheries are now overfished to the point where their current biomass is less than the level that maximizes their sustainable yield. Hybridization, genetic pollution, erosion and food security. In agriculture and animal husbandry, the Green Revolution popularized the use of conventional hybridization to increase yield. Often, hybridized breeds originated in the developed countries and were further hybridized with local varieties in the developing world to create a high yield strain sustained to local climate and diseases. Local governments and industry have been pushing hybridization. Formerly, a huge gene pools of various wild and indigenous breeds have collapsed, causing widespread genetic erosion and genetic pollution. This has resulted in loss of genetic diversity and biodiversity as a whole. GM organisms have genetic material altered by genetic engineering procedures such as recombinant convention on international trade in endangered species. Sites. Crops have become a common source for genetic pollution. not only of wild varieties but also of domesticated varieties derived from classical hybridization. Genetic erosion coupled with genetic pollution may be destroying unique genotypes, thereby creating a hidden crisis which would result in severe threat to our food security. Climate change. Global warming is also considered to be a major potential threat to global biodiversity in the future. For example, coral reefs, which are biodiversity hotspots, will be lost in 20 to 40 years if global warming continues at the current trend. Climate change has seen many claims about potential to affect biodiversity, but evidence supporting the statement is tenuous. Increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide certainly affects plant morphology and is acidifying oceans, and temperature affects species ranges. In 2004, an international collaborative study on 4 continents estimated that 10% of species would become extinct by 2050 because of global warming. Human overpopulation. From 1950 to 2011, world population increased from 2.5 billion to 7 billion and is forecast to reach a plateau of more than 9 billion during the 21st century. At least until the middle of 21st century, worldwide losses of pristine biodiverse land will probably depend much on worldwide human birth rate. Conservation biology matured in the mid-20th century as ecologists, naturalists and other scientists began to research and address issues pertaining to global biodiversity declines. The conservation ethic advocates management of natural resources for the purpose of sustaining biodiversity in species, ecosystems and evolutionary processes and human culture and society. Conservation biology is a reforming around strategic plans to protect biodiversity. Perceiving global biodiversity is a priority in strategic conservation plans that are designed to engage public policy and concerns affecting local, regional and global scales of communities, ecosystems and cultures. Action plans identify ways of sustaining human well-being, employing natural capital, market capital and ecosystem services. Protection and restoration techniques. As sustainable populations of the remaining native species in the area become assured, missing species that are candidates for reintroduction can be identified using databases such as the Encyclopedia of Life and the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Resource allocation. Focusing on limited areas of higher potential biodiversity promises greater immediate return on investment, rather spreading resources evenly on focusing on areas of little diversity but greater interest in biodiversity. A second strategy focuses on areas that retain most of their original diversity, which typically require little or no restoration. These are typically non-urbanized, non-agricultural areas. Tropical areas often fit both criteria, given their nativity, high diverse and relative lack of development.